I'm Ken Kelly, and I've got a real burning passion for counselling skills. I've built training that takes the doubt out of using counselling skills. You get to see the counselling skills used in real live sessions by a qualified therapist. Full sessions, real material, real counselling skills. To find out more, go to counsellingskillsacademy.com.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hi, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, is Ken. How are you this morning, Ken?
I'm well. I'm grateful to be here. Thank you very much for asking, Rory. And both Rory and myself were so grateful that you've joined us. You've joined us for the Counselling Tutor Podcast. This is episode number 232. And we got three great topics that we're going to be bringing you today, starting off with our Counselling Foundations, where we revisit that underpins good counselling practice, sometimes the theories, sometimes the skills. Today it is a theory and a theorist, dare I say, Mr. Albert Ellis, and we're going to be looking at the REBT model. Back in time to the 50s. Then we move on to focus on self, to the present day, where we recognize you are the heartbeat of your practice, and we look at how we can stay well within our practice and best serve our clients. And today we're going to be looking at what do we do when a client asks us a question. How can we behave in that kind of situation? Is that too probing and delving? Do we need to be closed? How do we answer that? And then we go into Practice Matters, which is where we look at what we may come across within the day-to-day running of a practice. And Rory, you met up with a luminary in the field to speak about vicarious trauma impact and management.
Yes, I met up with Erene Hadjiioannou, and you'll hear that later on in the episode.
Well, stay tuned for that one. We're going to start off with those foundations, lay the foundations. Rational Emotive Behavioural Therapy, or REBT, I guess the roots of CBT, or Cognitive Behavioural Therapy, going back in time to speak about Mr. Albert Ellis, Rory.
Yes, Albert Ellis, who of course left us in 2007, but left us with a rich legacy. And indeed, as you've alluded to, Ken, the foundations of cognitive therapy. And I don't think you can say too much about Albert Ellis, because he took kind of a behaviorist approach and made it into a therapy. And I think one of the interesting things about all of the theorists who stand the test of time is that they all bring something from their own life. I think it was John Schleen, a very famous person-centered therapist, that said, all theory is autobiographical. And this certainly was the case for Albert Ellis, because he was a very shy boy, brought up in New York, and he wanted to find himself a girlfriend, and he was very shy amongst women and girls, if I can use the word girls nowadays. And he went into the local park and set himself a goal of talking to 100 women to get over that fear. And that kind of set the foundations of him challenging irrational beliefs. Ooh. And that's the foundation of REBT: action, belief, and consequences. An activating event, you form a belief, and then you live the consequences. And, he had a strong philosophical base. He drew from Marcus Aurelius, who was a Stoic, who talked about, being stoic in the face of difficulties. The obstacle is the way, which is a very popular stoical kind of mantra. And he also drew from Epictetus, who was another Stoic philosopher. And I think it was Epictetus who said, man isn't disturbed by what happens. It's his perceptions of what happens, if I'm getting my philosophers correctly. And he would challenge people's perceptions. And many years ago, I used a little bit of REBT on the side of the road, Ken. I was working in a hostel, and I just nipped out for my lunch, and I heard a bit of a crash. It was a car crash. Someone had pulled out from the side of the road and hit another car. And it was interesting, the two people involved, the person who had been hit was pretty sanguine about it. So, oh, well, we've got insurance, no one's dead. My bumper's just a bit scratched, and they exchanged off they went. But the person who'd actually pulled out was quite distraught, and they were saying things like, "I'll never be able to drive again. My car's a write-off, and I'm a bad driver." And she was talking to me, and I said, "Well, where's the evidence that your car's a write-off?" And she said, "Well, it's bumped. The front's bumped." I said, "But it still drives, doesn't it?" And she went, "Well, yeah." And I said, "Where's the evidence you're a bad driver?" And she said, "Well, I've had an accident." And I said, "Well, everybody has an accident. I know I have. I've had accidents. And, if you drive long enough, you're going to have a bump." And then she said, "And I'll never drive again." And I said, "How are you going to get home?" And it was interesting that the thought process changed. Eventually, it was like, "Yeah, well, actually, you're actually right there." And she got in the car and off she went. And I went and got a sausage roll. But I thought that was a lovely little story. I used to share that with students when we taught about how just a practical application of, the activating event, forming a belief and living the consequences. And what I did was gently challenged her belief.
Yeah, it's an interesting model. So we're delving into behaviorism here, I guess. And the theory tells us how we think affects how we feel, and how we feel affects how we behave, and how we behave affects how we live our lives. And if you can change the thought, you can change the consequence. So the consequence is that we may come across in difficulty within our lives. And the theory kind of suggests maybe that is rooted in an irrational belief that we think about. And if we can change the thought pattern around that belief, we can change the way that we live our lives. And it's interesting how you were saying, looking back to the Stoic philosophers of times gone by. It's really interesting when I look there. So much of what they said is just as relevant today. It's like it never wears out. It doesn't. The modern society doesn't modernize who we are as human beings and how we act and how we socialize and how we process. And the thought of it is not what happens that affects our emotions. It is how we react to what happens within ourselves, and it's based in the beliefs we have. And an example I remember of that is this is not a true story. This is kind of just an example to paint the picture. It's somebody has a cat, and the cat is run over. And the neighbor sees the cat has been run over and then decides, I better phone this owner at work. And then thinks, actually, rather than phone them at work and potentially disrupt their day, I will wait until they get home. Now, here's the thing. When the person got home, the neighbor said, your cat was run over today, and the person was suddenly devastated. And if you said to that person, why are you so devastated? They might say, because my cat has been run over. Now, the interesting thing is, it's not the running over of the cat that caused the devastation. It was the hearing that the cat had been running over, the realization of that, and then how that was processed within the person. Because, of course, the cat was run over early that morning. And the person went through their day without being devastated until they heard the news. So it's how we react. It's not the cat being run over that causes the distress. It's the hearing of that and how we then choose to process it. ABCD model, as it is sometimes called, the action. For example, you crash your car, as you were saying, Rory, and then the belief, this leads you to believe that you're a bad driver, and then the consequence, you stop driving because you fear that you're going to have another accident, and that's it, you kind of held hostage. So within this model, there is a D, and that is the disputing of that irrational belief, where you might go to that person and point out that they've been maybe driving for 20 years. Where was the bad driving then? It is just this one incident. So you're disputing the irrational belief of I am a bad driver by using the evidence. You've got the evidence of the 20 years of previous driving where everything was fine. And hopefully then the process within the person themselves is that they can dispute themselves that irrational belief and come to terms with that and go, actually, you know what? I have been driving for 20 years. This was a little bit of bad luck, or whatever that may have been. Let me get back out in that car again. ABCD model.
Yes, and it's a very elegant model, I have to say, Ken. It's incredibly elegant, but also crucially, it puts thinking at the top of the food chain.
Yes.
So So, as you said earlier, with that model of how we think, how we feel, how we behave, how it affects our lives, it puts thinking at the top of the chain. And I think it's a very useful axiom to live your life by. People who know me well will often hear me say, if asked a question, I think, I feel, and sometimes I may ponder this for a little bit. I may say, is it thinking or is it feeling? Is it thinking or is it feeling? And eventually I will fall onto either I feel this way and share my feelings about it, or I think this way and I share my thoughts about it. And I think that kind of demarcation line is about how much impact what I'm being asked it would have. So, if someone were to say to me, would you like a Ferrari?
Yes, please, Rory.
I might say, I feel I'd like a Ferrari, although I think I'd probably struggle getting in it nowadays. Certainly struggle getting out of one. I'd have to employ someone to pull me out. But I might say, I think, I feel that I'd love that. And then my thinking would say, well, it's totally impractical. I won't be able to get in and out of it. I couldn't afford to run it. And really, I don't think that it's really me, if I'm honest. I don't think it would fit to how I believe who I am. And I think it's a really good discipline, certainly as a therapist, to be able to demarcate those two areas, thinking and feeling. Feelings are important. We know that.
Yep.
But actually, thinking trumps it all, because no one wants a pilot. Can you imagine being in a plane and the pilot's saying, I think we're at 30,000 feet. I feel we're at 30,000 feet. I feel we've got enough fuel to land. I feel we're going in the right direction. There'd be panic in the cabin. Thinking is about evidence and making evidence, and feeling. There's a huge amount of room for feeling, and we know this as therapists, but I think it's about where they sit. And I think that's the legacy of cognitive therapies. It's about where it sits. And I think the other thing with REBT, it differentiates between CBT. And one of those things is that CBT sees all negative thinking as kind of irrational, is the headline. REBT actually says that there's some negative thinking which actually is good for you.
Yeah.
So grieving, loss, anger in REBT would be considered a negative emotion. So it's kind of granular as well. It's a very, very interesting theory. And one, we used to teach it. We used to teach it as opposed to CBT because of the granularity of it, Ken.
Yeah, and I like it. I find it very elegant. And when I first came across the REBT theory, I started applying it to my own life, and I found there was lots of personal development there. And we may see this present with our clients. So I'm going to share things that came up for me that then was visible within my counselling practice. Is when a client comes in and they might say, "Oh, I'm not very good at such and such a thing," or "I can't do that because I'm not very good at such and such a thing." And it's interesting that is going to be based in their belief. And there was some sales training I did years ago, Rory, back in my corporate days when I was in sales, and the saying was, if you think you can, and if you think you can't, then you can't. So whether you believe you can or you can't, you're 100% right, and it shows the power of the reality we create from that we think. Now the thing is, our thinking is fallible. It is fallible, and we can create irrational beliefs, as it is called in REBT, or beliefs that are not serving us in any way, that are in some way hindering us. And you're 100% right, Rory, that some beliefs, I'm a little afraid of heights. That's a good thing. That's all right, And there are other people that maybe are not, and they can go up mountains. But I'll stick with I am scared of heights. I'll say that and be happy to stick with it because I know it preserves my life. But not all of those irrational thoughts serve us. Some of them hold us back, and that it's about when a client may present and they're really struggling with something that is holding them back in their life based on an irrational belief, something that happened that they then kind of anchored in, that is how it is. Maybe that was how it was in that moment. But of course, the evidence may suggest that outside of that moment, it's a little bit different.
Yeah, and we used to see that when we taught, didn't we, Ken? I remember, first day of the class, maybe a level 2 class, people come in and I go, hello, I'm Rory, and welcome everybody in. We might do a bit of a kind of ice-breaking exercise. And then I'd say, so I'll just tell you a little bit about myself, tell a little about practice. And I'll say the other thing is I'm dyslexic. So if you can see a word that's not spelt correctly, as I'm not teaching an English class, I'm teaching counselling, you tell me and I'll try and correct it. And you used to get people who were absolutely stunned. They'd say, you're a teacher and you're dyslexic. And I go, yeah, what's the problem with that? And they go, well, I'm dyslexic and I've been told by teachers I was stupid. I said, so was I. I said, and they were wrong. And they were wrong. And they were wrong in your case. And, you breathe a sigh of relief. I remember, Ken, you talked about on the podcast your experience of that when you first went to train.
Yeah, as a dyslexic as well, and something that I hid away. And then you were my tutor, and you mentioned you were dyslexic, wrote on the whiteboard at the time, the brand new technology that had just come in. This is how far away that was back in time. And it kind of gave me permission to relook at that, something that I hid, that I was ashamed of, I now proudly own. It is who I am and how I am made. I'm neurodiverse, and this is the way my head works. I'm not less than, but I used to believe I was. And because of that, there was a shame element around that where I would hide it away. So I was able to challenge the irrational belief that I'm not academic, I'm a bit slow, I'm slower than the rest, I can't excel in these kind of situations, by an example from another, which was yourself. So it's not always us as the therapist using logic to dispute the person's irrational belief. We can do that in our way of being, which is a very person-centered way, I guess, of doing it. And it's interesting when I'm saying the words person-centered here, and we're talking about behaviorism and we're talking about person-centered, they feel quite far away from each other. And I say that because you were speaking earlier, Rory, about how this is about thinking. It's about the computer part of our body that reasons and thinks. And the other side, which we deal with, I guess, a lot in therapy, is as of the I feel. And where does the I feel come from? I'm feeling this. Why? Where is the root of the I feel? Does the root of the I feel sit in an emotion which is separate from our thinking and reasoning, or is it a result of the thinking and reasoning? So it's interesting how they meld together in a way. And we speak about in person-centered therapy, we'll talk about introjected values, the beliefs and values of others that we take on, adopt for ourselves, and then start acting from those. I'll give you an example. I'm sitting there as a scholar in my early years in school. I'm not able to keep up with the class. The teacher says, you need to try harder. You're not putting in enough work. I'm feeling now, hold on now, I'm feeling I am less than, I'm feeling I'm slower than. And of course, that you can put it down to say that is introjected values if you want to look from a person-centered point of view. If you want to go to REBT, you can say, well, that is now an irrational belief that was brought about from the situation you found yourself in. I nearly didn't go and train to become a counsellor. I nearly didn't do it. And then when I did do it, I nearly dropped out because I got a referred assignment and thought, you know what, there it goes. Now we're going to transactional analysis. I'm getting out my script now and I'm ticking the script that says that I can't do this. So it's interesting how all the theories kind of meld together, cover the same humanity, the human condition, Rory. And I go right back to those Stoic philosophers. They had it then already. I think all the theorists, all they did was read those early works and go, oh, that's a good idea. How can I use theoretical words to name that?
Well, I think you're right, Ken, and I think a lot of the people who developed theories were all classically educated, so they've been introduced to philosophers and writers and a wider range of thinking, and I think that, you know, as I've said before, I think all theory is autobiographical. Yeah. I think that it kind of resonated, you know, it certainly resonated with Rogers, you know, and we talked about Søren Kierkegaard. It certainly resonated with Albert Ellis when he looked at the Stoic philosophers, and from there a theory was developed. But I think it's usually taught as a comparative theory. You can do REBT training, but it's usually not, in my experience, a first training. It's usually a comparison as part of compare and contrast different theories. But in practice, it is mightily useful because you can challenge someone's perception quite gently. And you don't have to be an outward challenge. You can say, I've had clients who said, I felt myself really, really frightened when that happened. And I would say, well, if that happened to me, I'd be frightened. And they say, really? And I go, yes. And that can generate huge amounts of movement. When someone else says, well, I would have thought or felt the same way as you, that alters the thinking. And the thinking then is, oh goodness, someone else reacts like that. I'm not on my own. And I think that's really, really important. But it's interesting, and I'd issue a challenge out there to anybody. How often do you actually catch yourself saying, I'm thinking or I'm feeling? Do you differentiate them? And if you don't, maybe worth thinking, if that might be a good idea. It's certainly been useful for my personal development, Ken.
Yeah, definitely. And a great place to explore that is your journal. What kind of language are you using when you're writing your journal and recording what came up for you in the day? And I'd like to end this topic, Rory, pretty much doing full circle to where we started. And you were speaking about Marcus Aurelius, and you were saying the obstacle is the way. It's a lovely saying. I hold that saying very dear to me.
Yeah.
The obstacle is the way. As therapists, we're working with those that come to us to share the darker parts of their journey, the struggles that they face in life. And by working and serving that client group, there are times when people will have a breakthrough, like where maybe an irrational thought may be disputed, and the person is freed from that. And the freeing from that liberation from that, can make such a massive impact. And I look to myself, my irrational belief of I am stupid, I'm not academic, I can't do this, I'm slower than others. Once I was released from that, I was able to study, get quite good at studying, enjoy studying. And if it hadn't been for the release from that, Counselling Tutor would never have been born. We would never have taught together, Rory. We would never have created the Counselling Tutor. There would be no Counselling Tutor podcast. So the obstacle of me feeling that stuckness and I'm less than was an obstacle. But after getting over that obstacle, being freed from that obstacle, the obstacle of, it's not just me who struggles with this, thousands struggle. When we're teaching with you, Rory, how many of our students said, I'm not very academic, I wasn't very good in a school environment. So many. Recognizing that, using that obstacle to make a way for others, which is hopefully the founding principles of Counselling Tutor. Lovely topic. Thanks for bringing it, Rory. And of course, there's a handout, isn't there? A super duper handout that Rory has made, Albert Ellis REBT, and you can get that by going to counsellingtutor.com. That's our mother website. Click on the podcast tab, make your way to today's episode. That's episode 232. You can download that for free right there on the page. Counselling Foundations, REBT. Moving on to a focus on self, Rory, where today we're looking at what happens when clients ask a question, and they do.
They do. It's true, Ken. And actually, this question gets asked quite a lot in our Facebook page. And if you're not a member of our Facebook page, you should join us and join the party. How do you find us? Well, it's really simple. You go to counselling, you go to Facebook, you type in Counselling Tutor, you'll find us. We're a closed group. We're going to let you in. And you can join hundreds and thousands of like-minded people all talking about different aspects of counselling and psychotherapy. Students, we've got qualified colleagues, we've got supervisors, we've got a smattering soup song of tutors, all talking about the world of counselling and psychotherapy, different modalities, different trainings, different views. And this comes up when a client asks you a question. And this takes me back to my first training, sat in that corner room in Hyde on a sunny afternoon, where this question was brought up. And one of my tutors, she said, and she did the usual thing, tutor. What do you think? What would you do? What would you do? And everybody gave different views. I wouldn't say anything. I'd say it's not my duty to advise. And she quoted from a book, and she said, this was asking, I think it was Pete Saunders, the late Pete Saunders, and it was in one of the early person-centered Counselling in Action books, one of the earlier editions. And this was brought up, and he said, if the client asks you, what would you do? He would say, anything I want. And I thought, what a great answer. What a great answer. Pushes it back to you. And I do think that, therapy is relational. So there are some questions where a client asks me, I may give them an answer. So, I'm not a therapist who if asked, we might be breaking with a client for a break, and you go, are you going on holiday? And saying things like, I wonder why you're interested in where I'm going on a holiday. I think I wouldn't be coming back if my therapist said that to me. I think, come on, I'm just asking a question. And I just say I'm going somewhere sunny, and move on from that. And I think that fielding questions from clients is really, really a skill. There are some questions that you can answer, and there are some where they're looking to you for the answer so that they can take that away. My counsellor told me, and you have to be thoughtful about that. And I think it's always, for me, Ken, anyway, always falls down to choices. What choices do you have? And I will say to a client, okay, you're asking me, I just wonder, I might look at the choices I have. What choices do you have? Do you see how I gently batted that back? And a client might say, well, they're all poor choices. And I'll say, well, which is the least poor? And, that way you're putting it to the client. But I think in early training of the students, it can kind of stump you a bit. You can get like a rabbit in the headlights. But after a bit, you can differentiate between the questions you can answer and the questions where really you need to kind of reflect them back in a slightly different way, Ken.
And I think this keys in very nicely to a recent topic we discussed, which is self-disclosure, where we might bring part of ourself and our own journey. And you can listen to that, just go through our previous podcast. I think it was only 1 or 2 back.
Yeah.
And you can hear about that. So we're saying here, when a client asks you as the therapist a question, when they ask you a direct question, how do you act? And it's very interesting, Rory, you said there's 2 flavors to this. One you can answer, and one you want to keep away from and maybe back to them. So if it's like you said, it's a holiday time, it's a break, and the client says, well, are you going away on a holiday? That's maybe a question that you can answer. How does that relate to them, their journey, their presentation, what they're bringing, what they're processing? It's the kind of question I might ask a colleague or a friend. Or where are you going? Or where did you go? Where did you hang out? But as soon as the client is looking to you for the answer to their what they're processing, what they're going through at the moment. So I'll use an example of let's go back to the previous example of the cat that was hit by a car in our previous topic that we discussed. The client comes in absolutely devastated. They've lost their cat that they've befriended, they've had for 10 years. They love this cat, and they might say to you, well, it's terrible. I'm feeling like such and such and such. Have you ever lost a cat? Looking to, well, can you empathize with me? Can you understand where I'm going through? Have you ever lost a child? Have you ever gone through a divorce? Have you ever, whatever, insert here? What are they looking for there? They're looking for, can we empathize? Would you answer that? And we're not here to tell you what to answer, what not to answer. It's about thinking what matches for you in your practice. Are they looking for an answer? So let's take drug and alcohol dependence. I worked in that for some years. Somebody comes in, they're struggling with that, and they say, well, what do you know? Have you ever been addicted to heroin? Would you share that? Would it be useful to them? How would you respond to that question? We can't give you an answer because it's about that idiosyncratic situation. But it's worth thinking about when that is just a question that you can answer, when they're looking maybe for more information or I guess, psychological education on a topic, you might be able to share some stuff. Yeah, it's interesting. I remember taking this to supervision often, Rory. I'd often go in with questions. Questioning from the therapist to the client is a tricky area. And then when the client is asking the therapist a question, oh my goodness, it can be a very sticky area indeed. And I think many people have different boundaries and feelings of how they might respond to that.
Yeah, and I think some therapists are more boundaried, maybe, are more reluctant to have self-disclosure. And, I think every therapist has to make a decision of where that boundary sits. But I do think that answering questions speaks to the relationship. And I'll give you an example. I'm going to change a few details for confidentiality. But many, many years ago, and I'm talking many years ago, I was working with a client, and at the end of the session, I opened the door for him, and he went out. And he said to me, "Can I ask you a question?" And I said, "Yeah, of course you can." And he said, "Do you like opera?" And I said, "No, not particularly." And he went, "Well, you've got a double barrel name." He said, "I would imagine that you'd like opera, because, Rory Lees Oakes, obviously that double barrel name, people love opera." And I said, "No," I said, "it's not really for me." I said, I may listen to it. I said, "It's not really for me." So he said, "What do you listen to?" I said, "Well, I'm quite a fan of Oasis, really." And he went, "Really?" And I went, "Yeah." Oh, and off he went. And I kind of went on my way, and I thought, that was an interesting conversation. Next session, completely different client, more open, engaged more. He saw me through a certain prism. And he obviously thought that I was maybe in a different social status to him, or that we weren't really connecting. Just by answering that question purely and simply, it was a different relationship, and it carried on. And it was striking, and it was a pivotal moment in the therapy, outside the therapy room, in a question that was just asked as I opened the door, and we stood out the door, and he was on his way. So, yeah, I think sometimes, don't underestimate that questions can form the relationship. And as we know in therapy, the relationship is a big factor, big common factor in the success for clients.
Yeah, it's interesting, Rory, how that was kind of an interesting question based on a frame of reference that was held. That frame of reference was changed thanks to your congruence and asking that question. And of course, if there was this kind of "I will not ask questions," it could have been a situation of, "Well, I hear you asking me if I like opera, and I'm wondering why that might be," And I think that I wonder if that would have brought that change about within that client. It's certainly appropriate within that moment. And I guess where it becomes inappropriate is, what would you do if you were me? That's a tricky one. What would you do? Yeah. What should I do? This is happening for me. This is what's going on for me. What should I do? I need you to give me the answer. That's when it becomes tricky, because therapy is empowering. It's empowering the person to work through the challenges they're facing within their own lives, find their own breakthrough that is theirs to own, and then to build and grow within that. So, disrupting that, we can't say, "Well, if I were you, what I would do is," would take that power away, I guess. They need to find their way. But how do we answer a question like that? So, client in a predicament, they've explained where they're at, and they go, "What should I do?"
Well, I think it comes down to batting it back and saying, "Well, what choices do you have?"
Yes.
And putting it straight back to them, and going through the choice and say, "So, is there any choice there that is better than the other choices?" And letting them think about it. I think that it is a question that I've been asked it more times than I can think about. I'm sure you have, Ken, in practice. What if you were me? What would you do? And sometimes I have said I'd do anything I felt was right for me. I've said that. I've reframed that. Pete Sanders' response just a little bit. So I'd do what I believe was right for me. What the choice that was the best, that gave me the best outcome. And I'd say, and maybe you have to, kind of reflect on that. And occasionally you do get clients who are very, very persistent. And, I would be really honest and say, I don't know, because it's not happening to me, but I know it's happening to you. And it seems that you're looking outwardly for the answers.
Yes, I like that. I like that. And of course the answers lie inwardly. And sometimes that question of what should I do can be a rhetorical question. I've certainly had times in my life where there's nobody around and I'll go, oh, what am I going to do here? I'm speaking to myself. It's part of the processing. So we will hear that within therapy. And I love your response, Rory. I love your response. And of course, taken from Pete Standard's quote there, I can see the link in that. And something that I would use on occasion was, I would go back in with a question. So the person would go, oh, what do I do in this situation? And I would go in with, what does your gut tell you?
Yeah.
And it's a way of directing them to look, so often our feelings might be saying one thing, our mind might be saying, and then you'll hear someone say, oh, my heart is saying this, but my brain is saying that, or my gut feel is telling me this, but I think I should do that. And there's an incongruence there, which you can unearth and work with when those questions do come. So the questions, when they come your way, if it's a question that you can answer, of course, answer it. You never know, it may move the process of the client, as it did in your case, Rory. If it's about their journey and what they should do within their journey, have a think, process. How can you work with that? Always good to go in with forearmed, I guess, so that you're not caught off guard when that question comes in, because a response that you don't want to be doing when a person goes, oh, I'm in this situation, what do I do here? Not helpful is, I hear you asking me what you should do.
Yeah. Or are you asking me, or are you asking yourself?
Oh, I do like that, Rory. There's a little bit of a hand clap going on there. I like that. The importance of just getting together with a peer and discussing these topics. And so often we say it, I'm going to say it again, Rory and I are not here to tell you how to run your practice or what you should and shouldn't do. We are two peers getting together and discussing topics that are discussed in our Facebook group or that come up that are topical. And there's just so much power and growth and learning and knowledge in chatting with a peer. I like that, Rory. I'm writing it down.
Yeah, it's mine, I think that some might say, see what I did there, linked to an Oasis song. Some might say the answer's in the looking glass, which is another link to an Oasis song. But yeah, it's a definite skill, fielding questions and sensing what is the question being asked to self or to me, or is it hanging in the room? And I think that only comes with seasoning as a therapist. I think that you get the rhythm of the client, you pick up the rhythm of the client, and you can key into that. It's a kind of a level of empathy, the beats of the relationship, and I think it's an area that needs attention, because it happens more often than we think. I'm sure there's people nodding away when they're listening to this saying, yes, that does happen. Yeah.
Yeah, and you did a call out as we went into this, Rory, saying this is a question that comes up often in the Facebook group. And if you've got something that you use or something that's come up for you without obviously sharing any client journey or anything, jump into the Facebook group and share that, because I've certainly learned from your sharing today, Rory. I really have, and that's what this is about. If we have these discussions, if we chat about it, if we have the discussions in the Facebook group, it's incredible what can come up, and that is why we focus on those on that self within our practice. You are the beating heart. So moving away from focus on self onto practice matters, Rory, speaking today about vicarious trauma impact and management. Big, heavy topic.
It's a big, heavy topic, and it is, to coin a well-known phrase that we use, it is a focus on self. Vicarious trauma is something that can take us and really, really give us a hard time. And I was really grateful to catch up with a great friend of Counselling Tutor, Erene Hadjiioannou, who has done an absolutely fabulous lecture on vicarious trauma and its impacts. And I asked her a few questions about the lecture and vicarious trauma in general. And this is what she had to say.
Practice matters.
The National Counselling Society is proud to sponsor Practice Matters. National Counselling Society are really excited to have launched their Children and Young People Therapist Register for counsellors working with the younger age group. To find out more, visit nationalcounselingsociety.org. nationalcounselingsociety.org.
And it's my great pleasure to welcome back to the podcast Erene Hadjiioannou, who is produced a fantastic lecture for the Counsellor CPD Library on vicarious trauma, impacts and management. So, Erene, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me again.
So, just to outline to the listener, I guess, what is vicarious trauma? What is that?
Okay, so there's two ways we can look at it. One is from a medical perspective by referring to the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. So this doesn't appear within the DSM-5, but within the ICD-11, frontline workers such as ourselves, counsellors, psychotherapists, can develop post-traumatic stress symptoms. So if you look at those criteria, we're thinking about how do we maybe experience traumatic material. If we're talking about vicarious trauma, we may be talking about re-experiencing and carrying around traumatic material that we've picked up through our work. So exposure to that in that context. And there are also many of us practitioners with lived experience of trauma as well. So that can be tapped into. I would say also from a more sort of humanistic person sort of centered perspective, that in terms of vicarious trauma, in plain terms, it's about how might we as practitioners be impacted by the work that we do and exposure to listening to sort of traumatic stories, being in the room with people whose nervous systems are dysregulated. Of course, we pick that up as well. So there's a couple of different ways to think about it.
Yes, and I think what's really, really interesting is that you spoke about DSM and ICD-10. Those are diagnostic manuals, and those are very much a medical model manual, aren't they? Where someone would be diagnosed with something. One is a European manual, the ICD, or ICD-11 now, I think it might be. And DSM is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which is developed by the American Psychological Association. And vicarious trauma is a real thing, isn't it? If you work with people long enough who have experienced trauma, then it's very possible that, I guess, two things can happen. One is, as you outlined, that you can become traumatized by hearing the material, or that it triggers trauma from your past. Would that be an accurate summary?
That would be a fair summary, and I would also add the fact that as human beings, we're all wired the same to deal with stress. So knowing a little bit about the neurophysiology of stress, including traumatic stress, which is one of the most intense experiences of stress we can have, sort of really just strips it back down to basics. We can all be affected by stressful things to varying degrees, and that sets off our nervous systems, and we get dysregulated in lots of different ways, perhaps in the same way as our clients might be when we're working with them.
I mean, and could be a real issue, couldn't it? Because if you're in the room with a client and all of a sudden you become traumatized and disassociate, that could be really difficult. Is that something that could really happen, do you think, or you've experienced from your experience? Yeah,
I would say for sure. There definitely has to be, I think Babette Rothschild says very clearly, and I'm definitely paraphrasing, but she says, at least one person in the room needs to be grounded and present, i.e. we can't both be kind of traumatized, triggered, dysregulated. Otherwise, there's no room for therapeutic work as we might understand it. So yes, absolutely.
Yes, and I think that's an interesting one, isn't it? That psychological contact, we talk about the psychological contact being essential, but also presence is something that's essential. The therapist has to be present and has has to be grounded. Now, in your lecture, you talk about the impact of it. What is the impact of vicarious trauma to those of us who work in the therapy profession?
Yeah, so this again is where we might look to sort of diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder or even complex post-traumatic stress disorder. But I'll put it in simple terms that kind of includes that in the equation. So we might have trouble kind of regulating our moods. We may go into a state of hyperarousal. So we are overstimulated from a neurophysiological perspective. So we might be agitated, irritated, angry, panicked, anxious. This is where fight or flight might come in as a very intense stress response. Conversely to that, you may also experience a state of hypoarousal, which is where our bodies are sort of understimulated and we start shutting down. So the most intense version of that is to freeze. Dissociation happens here. If you're somebody that gets depressed, that can happen in that place as well. So lots of people kind of tend to fall into one category or another, but equally you can actually experience both, one after the other. So I think it's really important for practitioners to know what are the signs for me that I'm getting stressed, even low level stressed, because obviously that can have a cumulative effect, which might sort of lead to vicarious trauma as we're phrasing it today.
Yes, and sometimes what you're referring to is sometimes called a window of tolerance, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
Where we sit within a window where we can tolerate things and we can get hyper aroused, or as you say, we can start to shut down. And that's at the point where people disassociate. Now, in your lecture, you talked about the management of it, and I think that's an important thing, isn't it? I've always believed that when one is looking at our practices, we should be thoughtful maybe of how many clients we have who have trauma. Because if we're seeing traumatized client after traumatized client after traumatized client, I'm guessing that's going to raise the possibility that vicarious trauma may impact on you.
Yeah, that's right. And also we're all human beings. One thing that I always say is, once the sort of the therapy appointment ends, both ourselves and our clients go back out into worlds that are re-traumatizing. I work a lot with survivors of sexual and domestic violence. So the principle applies, even if you're not a direct victim or survivor of those two things, we both coexist in a world where those things do happen. Equally, we as practitioners have personal lives as well as professional lives. So I developed a concept called dynamic loops, which is basically looks like a kind of a balloon sort of shape. And it's a way to sort of assess, okay, what spaces do I occupy in my working week, my regular everyday life, as I sort of, go about what I normally do personally and professionally, like what spaces do I occupy and how many of those are, it mean that I come into contact with traumatic or even low level stress. And do I have any spaces that are free from that, where I can, to use the language that we're touching on today, where I can be in my window of tolerance, get some rest and respite from these stressful things that I'm experiencing?
Absolutely. And I think that has to be built into a practitioner's, or almost into their diary to make sure there's some. I'm a great believer in decompression, where there's a space where you can decompress and sit within that window of tolerance and let your autonomous nervous system settle before you see the next client. And it's not something that's taught in first trainings, is it? Trauma isn't touched on in a lot of first trainings, I don't think.
I don't want to make a sweeping generalization, but I will definitely say from my experience, the majority of what I've picked up has been post-training, although it was covered a little bit in mine, because that's just part of the nature of doing the work and coming into contact with people that need support. So yes, I totally agree with you in terms of decompressing, getting in your window of tolerance, So in terms of what that might look like, I mean, even in session, if you're doing sort of grounding techniques or any sort of breath work or anything like that with your clients, it's not just for them. It also means that you get the opportunity to practice that, switch which bit of your nervous system you're using. So you're sort of operating in your window of tolerance rather than just being stressed.
Yes, and I take on board, not making sweeping statements, which I fear I may have done, but I think the general feedback I get, and having taught for 10 years, is that certainly college curriculums don't really cover it in any great detail. Whether individual tutors choose to do individual modules on that, and I hope they do. That's a great thing, but it is something that is presenting more and more. I think practitioner burnout is a real thing, and we're seeing it more and more. And I think, as you alluded to, professionals in other professions, not just counselling and psychotherapy, are seeing the impacts of vicarious trauma. I'm thinking of our colleagues, in the medical profession during the COVID. We're seeing it discussed more and more, across disciplines.
Yeah, I really hope that helps to normalise rather than pathologise or medicalise further sort of post-trauma symptoms. Like I say, we're all wired to respond to stress, i.e. survive it in the moment, as well as how we might carry it around afterwards. That applies to practitioners as well as clients. And I definitely would agree with you that, part of what happened during the COVID-19 pandemic, through movements such as Black Lives Matter, there's so much around us in terms of, transgender people's rights as well. So there's people that are sort of literally fighting to just exist safely as the people that they are. So I would, in my work, I definitely sort of keep an open mind as to, okay, if we're talking about what's the lived experience that's brought a client to therapy that means they've experienced something traumatic, that may be in relation to their identity as well as a sort of what we might typically understand as a quote unquote traumatic experience. So again, we all live in the same world as our clients. So it's very real for all of us. So yeah, absolutely. I think that there's so much more that could be done just to enable practitioners to, I would say, not be frightened of doing this work and also know how to take care of themselves as they're doing it. Yeah,
absolutely. And finally, what do you hope that people will get out of your lecture? When people finish watching the lecture, what do you hope they'll take away?
I hope that people will be able to understand vicarious trauma from, I guess, a couple of different lenses. So I talk about the ethics of, working within your remit of competency. So just expanding that a little bit more. And also finding out more about dynamic loops, how you can use it for yourself, how you can use it with clients just to manage, stressful work that we do. How do we look after ourselves? And ultimately just gain a better understanding of the window of tolerance model. Because like I say, we can practice what we preach, I think, with clients. We're all wired in the same way. So yeah, I definitely hope that helps people listening to the lecture.
Well, no wiser words really to end this podcast on. Vicarious Trauma Impact and Management is available in the Counsellor CPD library, and it just goes for me to say, Erene Hadjiioannou, thank you so much for joining us.
Big thank you to Erene. Big thank you to you, Rory, for reaching out, holding that interview, bringing us that information. If you would like to learn more about vicarious trauma, there is a complete lecture which you can access in the Counsellor CPD library. If you remember, log in. It is there and active for you. If you're not yet a member of the Counsellor CPD library, interested in joining, go to counsellingtutor.com. All the information is there. This has been Counselling Tutor Podcast, and it's been episode 232.
Wow. Well, we started off with Counselling Foundations and the work of Albert Ellis, the very root of cognitive behavioural therapy. We moved on to focus on self and discussed how we react and what we do when a client asks you a question. And then finally, we finished with this fantastic interview with Erene Hadjiioannou on vicarious trauma, its impact. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
If you're a qualified counsellor or psychotherapist, then why not check out the Counsellor CPD library? Stay current with your CPD requirements with over 150 hours of academically rigorous, on-demand lectures you can stream to your device. Joining Counsellor CPD will expand your skill set to create a more specialised, highly rewarding practice. For more information on the Counsellor CPD library, visit counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.